which Tariq says that Europeans associate Islam with violence, there is some truth in that. There is also a very obvious reason for that, which is that Islam is associated with violence. It was not Buddhists who flew planes into the Twin Towers. It was not Hindus or Jews that blew up the London Underground buses a few years ago. And that simple fact has to be acknowledged if you're even going to start a dialogue. We do have a problem. We have a problem when the failures of Islam throughout the world, the failures of all Islamic societies, come here into Britain. Their intolerance of freedom of conscience, their intolerance of apostates, their intolerance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, their intolerance of minorities, other religious minorities, sexual minorities, their intolerance of gays, their dislike and distrust of half of the population, women, and many, many other things. And the call, what's more, for a parallel legal system within Britain and European societies. This is monstrous. No other group behaves like this, asks for parallel laws. This is a fundamental problem, and it's one we're going to have to deal with. It's a problem between a society, Western Europe, that believes that laws are based on reason, and Islam that believes that they are based on revelation. Between these two ideas, I'm not sure there is very much compromise for Europe. It is not Europe that has let down its Muslims, but the Muslims of Europe that have let down Europe. This is not solely something which we have to say we can never reconcile. Of course we can reconcile this, but we need to be honest about it. We need to be frank about it, and we cannot avoid things just because they are unpleasant. And if there were one thing I would wish Muslims in Europe could learn today, as fast as possible, it would be this: that you have no right in this society not to be offended. You have no right to say that because you don't like something, you can commit violence, or you would like something to be stopped or censored. You have no right to have more hate laws, or hate crime laws, or hate speech laws, just to defend Islam. You have to realize, the Muslims of Europe have to realize, that a society in which even your deepest feelings can be trodden upon is the only society worth living in. And the sooner we can learn that, the sooner that Islam can learn that within Europe, the better. It is not Europe that has failed its Muslims. It is Islam that has failed Europe. I'd argue Islam has failed its Muslims. Thank you.
Douglas, I want to ask you, you heard some of the people from the floor there, the woman complaining about attacks on her because she's described as a scarfie because she wears a head veil. I mean, that is something that you would regret. I mean, that doesn't promote social cohesion.
Nobody thinks that any physical attacks or any such thing could be a good thing to happen. Of course not. Of course there are. Let's make sure we're right.
Talking about
prejudice exists in society. Let's just be absolutely clear as an audience. Prejudice undoubtedly exists in this society. It exists across racial groups, including from minorities to other minorities, after all, which is one of the things we see increasingly in Britain these days. And it is also the case that people, in particularly famously lower socioeconomic groups, are likely to feel hatred for other groups. That is one of the things that has to be tackled, and everyone, I think, in this hall, I'm sure, we're in agreement that that should be tackled. But do not mix up somebody, a thug, a racist, and so on, attacking somebody in a street with the right of Fleming and me to say what we see in the Quran, what we think of Muhammad, and maybe even asserting our right to say so.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to pick up on a couple of people, particularly women, who've said about the terrific things that Islam gives women in terms of rights. The first thing is, yes, in 7th century Arabia, some of this was progressive. In 21st century Britain, it is not. And you have to make that fundamental admission that the Quran is not a document for women's rights in Europe in 2010. It is not. Secondly, why is it that only Islamic societies and mosques in this country are places which teach and preach hatred of other minorities? Every single week in this country, there are people on campuses who teach the murder of minorities. Last week, it was somebody who calls for the murder of apostates. The week before, at another university, it was somebody who believes the Jews are fair game. This is not tolerable. It is not tolerable for Muslims. It is not tolerable from anyone else. You, I hope, would agree with me that any minority that engaged in such hatred and bigotry should be criticized. Don't pretend that the cloak of Islam And Islamic belief and religious fervor means that people like us cannot say that people who call for the murder of minorities are not mainstream, are not acceptable, and have to be critiqued.
You don't have to go very far in Britain, or the West in general at the moment, to find people's unwillingness to assert the superiority of their values. But they know the superiority of their values because they live with the superiority of their values. I talk at a lot of campuses, and I was at one last night in London where a student got up and started protesting because I had said that an Islamist government was of itself a bad thing, which I think it is. I just said to this student, and it's not a hard question you'd have thought to ask, I just said, well, name me one Islamist government state that you would want to live in. And this is a serious question, ladies and gentlemen. It is also a personal question, and one which, if people were honest, they would admit is personal. As a gay man, there's not a country that's run by Muslims which I could live in. One of my best friends is in hiding again tonight, Dayan Hirsi Ali, because of what she says, and she'd be killed if she went to any Muslim country. And I think that matters. And I think the way in which it affects our personal lives does matter, and we should not ignore it. We have the great blessing of living under this system, and we take it for granted, and we spit on it, and we can because we're living in that freedom. But I beg you, ladies and gentlemen, not to pretend that that means that we shouldn't assert the superiority of that system, because that is what it is. It is a superior system. It doesn't, I would stress this, it doesn't have to be violently asserted. Rights and values are not asserted by violence. They are asserted by showing people your rights. They are shown by example. If you do not speak up for your rights, if you do not say that you think that the rights that you enjoy should not be enjoyed by other people, or people with darker skin, or people in other countries, then I submit that you make a great error of judgment. Mr. Glass treated us to a textbook example of Western masochism. And I know some people in the hall enjoy that, because some people laughed and clapped when he cited Western civilization and epitomized it by what? World War, Nazism, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. Ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that the West should be treated and regarded only as something which is treated by its lowest moments, and believe that all other cultures and all other civilizations should be treated only by their highest moments, you're already putting in an unequal challenge here. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, I need hardly go without saying, ladies and gentlemen, were not representative of me, were not representative of the West. And the great difference that can't be reiterated enough, the great difference is that Lindy England is in prison. She is in prison and did not speak for the West. She was imprisoned and found guilty in the West, by the West, for the West. That matters, ladies and gentlemen, and it can't be stressed enough. Mr. Aronovich has already done this. But in Iran, when a couple was shot the other week for holding hands when not being married, the courts congratulated them. Ladies and gentlemen, it does not need you to want to assert your morals violently, to say that that stinks and we will not be a part of it. Mr. Ramadan then went on, and I think this is an important thing to talk about, to immigrants. He did exactly the same thing that Mr. Glass did. He treated us as a society as if we were a society that just abuses immigrants, that imprisons them, locks them up. I don't know where he gets that from. I see immigrants all across our streets, many of whom are doing very well. Most people in Britain have welcomed them. There hasn't been mass violence against these immigrants. By and large, they have been welcomed. How does that happen? How would the reverse happen in Saudi Arabia? How would the reverse of that happen in any Islamic culture? Why is it that every Jew in the Middle East has had to go to Israel? Why is it that we have made the de facto agreement that if there is to be a Palestinian state, it has to be Judenrein, clear of Jews? Because we treat them by a different standard, ladies and gentlemen, and we know it, and we will not do what we need to do, which is to say this is what works for us, and this is, we believe, what could work for other people. Mr. Ramadan said that we need dialogue. I agree. Everyone agrees we need dialogue. But where does it start? Would it start, for instance, with making a joke, contra Mr. Khomeini, not a very funny man? Or would it start with an article, perhaps, Would it start perhaps with a film? It did a few years ago with Submission, and Theo van Gogh was killed. Could it start with making a joke, perhaps? A joke in a cartoon? Well, apparently not, because we know that there were burnings and killings and lootings and riotings across the globe in reaction to those cartoons. If you're going to start a dialogue, what could you do that would be smaller than drawing a cartoon? If anyone has an idea, please let me know, but this dialogue which we keep on being offered is not reciprocated. And we can have the dialogue here in the West tonight. But how many of the countries that will be talked about by the other side could we have the same dialogue in? We get to discuss our failings because we are in the West. We get to analyze our failures because we are here, and I think that matters. Finally, if we do not assert our values, ladies and gentlemen, who will? Who will assert them across the Muslim world? Who are the reformers in the Muslim world going to look to when they want to see and desperately need separation of church and state? If we do not say, if we do not assert and state that we believe that is the best way to live, who is going to do it in the Muslim world? Who is going to feel emboldened to do it? And Urshid Manji said a few weeks ago when she was in London, said this: if you give up on us, if you give up on yourselves, people like me are dead. And ladies and gentlemen, I think we should take that call seriously. To assert the superiority of Western values is to state the obvious. It's to have faith in ourselves, and it's to have faith in other people. Thank you.
I have to pick up once again on the fact that, again, Mr. Glass has said that you, ladies and gentlemen in the room, are propping up anti- or pro-dictator regimes, that you in this room are doing deals with Saudi Arabia. Ladies and gentlemen, the West may have made and has made grotesque errors in propping up dictators in the Middle East. But we also manage not to prop them up. We've also, if you like, we have the antidote to poisons within us. Can that be said of other societies to the same extent? And please note Mr. Dalrymple's use of the word we. It was we when it was people carrying out massacres in the West, in the past, your forebears. It was only we when it's us doing bad things. When is it we expressed by Mr. Dalrymple of pride of what the West has done? That he cannot bring himself to do, and I hope you note it, ladies and gentlemen. This is masochism, and it's being offered to you by a sadist. What Professor Ramadan is doing is the reverse side of what I hear a lot of conservative right-wing politicians doing now, which is effectively we just have to give them a lot of time. You tend now to hear the thing about people needing their own reformation, Islam being 600 years younger and all this kind of thing. I recently heard exactly the same thing as Professor Ramadan was saying, uttered by Norman Lamont, Baron Lamont of Tehran. He said exactly the same thing. They need time. Tariq Ramadan said it's going to take time. How much time, ladies and gentlemen? I don't think we have time. And I would beg Professor Ramadan to go around the Muslim world explaining to women in Saudi Arabia they can look forward to freedom in 600 years' time. And that gay people in the Muslim world can look forward to having their first meaningful relationship 6 centuries from now.
Now, the violent reaction worldwide to the anti-Islam film Innocence of Muslims shows no sign of cooling down. Since the appearance of the low-budget film on the internet and the publication since of caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad in a French satirical weekly, scores of people have been killed in violence linked to the film, which has renewed debate over freedom of expression. So should we tolerate the publication of such provocative views, however distasteful and inflammatory, and simply choose to ignore them? Or should we try harder to understand why so many people have taken to the streets and protest?
Quickly, I mean, the thing of saying Muslims, of course, in this, is that in most countries it's a very small minority of people. I mean, and also we should bear in mind that a lot of political people are using this for their benefit. In Australia, the riots would seem to be led by, organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir. In Britain, the very small number of protesters who came out seem to have been affiliated with groups like the now banned Al-Mujahirun and so on. So let's not think this is, as it were, Muslims as a bloc taking offence. But there is a correct perception, I think, that Islam as a religion is more brittle and feels these things more woundedly than other religions, and there is a reason for that. I mean, in a couple of weeks' time in London, the musical by the creators of South Park, Mormonism the Musical, will begin. It's been going on Broadway for some years, packed out crowds, including Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, who said she was so offended by this film on the internet. So one of the things about this is that most religions by now have realised that being satirised, being critiqued, being even ridiculed and criticised. Let's face it, just criticised or looked at in a historical manner, as happened a few weeks ago with a film by Tom Holland on Channel 4. Even these things are felt very woundedly. And that's because all other religions, apart from Islam, have been through this period of criticism and have, as it were, come out to some extent, not completely at the other end. Islam has not been used to this process historically. It is not used to the idea that your deepest feelings can be trodden upon, and that is a right that people who do not share your faith
Douglas,
have.
what on earth are you talking about? Because how can Islam, which is a faith, it's a religion, it's an ideology, it's a way of life, you cannot talk about Islam in these broad, sweeping generalisations.
Well, you talked about Muslims in quite a
Islam doesn't feel things. Individual Muslims do. People who are mothers and fathers.
Can I get Ajmal?
If I could just
go ahead,
very
Douglas, and I'll bring
quickly
Ajmal in.
respond to that, because it is a very important point. There are lots of different strands of Islam, but in every Islamic society and in the world today and historically.
Do you mean Muslim majority countries?
No.
Societies?
Islamic societies, societies that have Islam within the rule of law, countries like Pakistan where Islam is a very important part of the constitution and of the governance of the country. These places all put a particular emphasis on the fact that the ridiculing of the Prophet Muhammad or all sorts of claims about him, asking whether he existed and so on, is blasphemy, and that blasphemy should be punished. The fact is that we can put it this way: an all-singing, all-dancing Mormon musical is a threat to nobody. Nobody thinks that Mormon mobs are going to go and kill anybody, or threaten to. But there is a risk, and it is a legitimate risk in the world today, that an all-singing, all-dancing Muhammad musical in the West End might not go off so well.
There is a very simple
word on this.
It comes down to a very fundamental point. Most people in this country are not Muslim, most people in France are not Muslim, and so on. We don't believe that Muhammad, if he existed, heard any angels speaking. It's the opinion of those of us who are not Muslim that he obviously either made it up or something else. Now, we think the same thing about Mormonism. Atheists obviously will believe the same thing about Jesus and about Moses and so on. But nobody has a problem saying, I'll make a film about Moses where he's made up the Ten Commandments. It was done very well by Mel Brooks. But nobody has a problem now watching a film saying that Jesus made it up. But they do have a problem, and we have a problem of censorship and self-censorship, because people are afraid to say that Muhammad made it all up, and the response to that, they know, is that they will stop saying it, they will pretend and hope they won't get any trouble, because they will pretend that they are sort of believing Islam. They'll say the Prophet Muhammad. They will try not to cause any offence.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there.
Profound nonsense. Gay people are not introduced into societies. It's not like somebody introduces the idea of homosexuality and a load of men think, oh, I know, I'll leave my wife for a man. Absolutely profound nonsense. Homosexuals have existed in every culture throughout society, not just because, by the way, it's worth reminding the church leaders of this, not because it's an act of sex, but because it's an act of love, because it's a basic requirement of human relationships for some people. Now, and as such deserves respect. One of the problems we have in this debate is always twofold. Firstly, that a lot of white, Western, liberal-minded people fear desperately condemning a backward attitude towards homosexuality in Africa in case it is seen itself as being colonialist. And then you have the problem of church leaders, and there are very many of them, I can tell you, because I've spoken to them and I've heard them speak, and the kind of filth that church leaders in Africa come out with about homosexuality is unforgivable and fundamentally, in my understanding, unchristian. What on earth happened to loving thy neighbour instead of not just condemning him, but saying he should be killed? This is the sort of filth that plays into basic prejudices in a society like ours and like Africa's, and the church should have no part in it. And all you can do is sit here and say that the church in America has behaved in too liberal a way. What is going to happen? How can we solve this? Either the African churches would come up to speed and African society would become more tolerant and more liberal, or the rest of the world has to go backwards. Which would you prefer?
Understanding, why don't the gays have some tolerance and have regard for the society where, in Uganda in particular, 95% of the people there support the death sentence? Why don't we have tolerance from the minority to the majority?
So what should gays do to tolerate that?
Well, they should
they tolerate their own murder, their own death, their own stoning?
How they tolerate it? They should have sensitivity towards what the society believes, and whatever they want to practice, it should be in absolute private.
But this is done in private. This is private.
No, it's in private. Nobody would know about it.
No, nonsense. This is private, and this is being done, as the gentleman here can tell you, against people doing this in their private lives. We're not even talking about what somebody like to say
know about it,
display.
it's not private anymore. Well, in Islam, it's slightly different, right? Although we condemn the gays the gays in Islam, like it does in Christianity, because the Bible and the Quran are originally from God. But in Islam, it's slightly different. If you do it privately, that nobody knows about it, because if people know about it, then it's not private anymore. You're not condemned. Well, I'm telling you, in Islam, if you do it so privately, then you will not be condemned. But once you announce it, once people know about it, you have to be punished.
Would you just put it this way around? Would either of you gentlemen sitting there be at all happy living your own life with your wives or whoever in entire secrecy, not being able to go out in public and tell anyone that you had a relationship with your wife, not being able to let any family know, living a life in secrecy like that, and the deal being that unless you kept this up throughout your life, you would be killed? Would you be happy with that life?
Is there a danger that little children are learning that some of their school friends are, unless they change, are going to go to hell? How dangerous is that, do you think?
Well, it's a wicked thing to do, perverted thing to do, to tell lies to children. I don't believe there's any heaven, and I don't believe there's any hell, although I quite often wish there were a hell for certain people to go to. But no, you notice very interestingly, by the way in which organised religion talks to people. The Christian churches, when they were very powerful in Europe, used to talk about hell a lot. As people have become more wise, more educated, more informed, more literate, the church is trying to sell itself to them differently. It's still the same with Islam now. When Islam is in total control of a society, it preaches hell. When it's in a society like this, it tries to sell itself rather nicer. So it doesn't talk about hell, it talks about heaven a bit more. This is like a group of tradesmen selling their rather sordid, tawdry goods.
But really, the most febrile and important discussion at the moment is the one that the free press is having across Europe, which is whether or not they will stand up and retain the right to do what we in Europe and free peoples have the right to do, which is to draw what we like. And the key message from this really can't be emphasized enough, because, you know, your guest in Doha is a cartoonist. He knows very well that he can't draw a cartoon of Mohammed there. Even if he wanted to, he wouldn't, because his life would be at great risk.
I wouldn't do that
you wouldn't
anyway,
do
sir.
it.
No.
And one of the reasons, you wouldn't do it. Okay,
sir,
maybe it's not just because. Can I just finish my point?
Okay, finish your point. Then we'll give Khalid a chance.
If you are a Muslim, you may decide not to do that. However, in countries like Britain and France, most of us are not Muslims, and we do not believe in Muhammad as the founder of any faith that we follow. People are Christians, atheists, all sorts of things. You cannot expect, and this is the crucial thing, Muslims should not expect non-Muslims to abide by their own belief systems. You can yourself decide, you as a Muslim do not want to depict Muhammad. But the idea that is coming along in Europe at the moment is a growing idea that people who are not Muslims, who do not believe in Muhammad, who do not follow Islam, are also to be have to obey the rules of Islamic blasphemy.
Where do you draw the line between radical Islam and what is Islam? Is that something that Europe is still grappling with? What is considered legitimate
between radical Islam?
Debate about radical Islam, and what is considered hate speech against Muslims when you have thousands of rallies of thousands of people saying, you know, calling basically that there is no place for Muslims and Muslim values in Europe?
If I could sorry, Douglas, you up on that?
No, can you let me finish actually my question? When you have thousands of people calling for calls which sound very similar to the minds of some for the calls for expulsions of Jews from Europe during the Second World War, where do you draw the line between what is legitimate debate and what is simply racism when it comes to Islam?
If an impartial viewer were watching your program, they'd come away with the idea that all Germans and French people are nascent fascists waiting to expel Muslims. Actually, you just painted, for a journalist, it's quite shocking. You just painted a completely inaccurate portrait of what is going on in protests in Germany, which in actual fact, if you look at it, are highly specific. Can I finish my point?
Let me correct you on a factual
you said
point. I didn't say all Germans or all French are looking to expel Muslims,
then you decided
and I
to
didn't
say
mention
that the
a
Germans
protest in any particular country. So now that we got the facts straight, please go ahead.
Your incredibly biased portrayal of European citizens starts from your misportrayal of people turning out at protests as being against all Muslims or wanting to expel them. And you the presenter in Doha, sit in Doha. It really is astonishing. You are painting a picture of Europe which is outrageous. Across the Middle East, cartoons are published every day, every week, with the most disgusting anti-Semitic propaganda, the most disgusting propaganda in them. And you sit in Doha, a not free society, and smear Germans and French people a mere 24 hours after this totalitarian
I've just corrected you. You don't seem to be hearing me, so let me correct you again. Sorry, sir. I did.
Ashgar Boghari here in the studio with me. When we look at that poll, public opinion sees these. They don't see them as being, as you say, racist. They just see them as being cartoons about religion.
A, I would say most people probably haven't even seen them. Two, and
well, that's because they're not being published in any of the mainstream papers.
Rightly so. We wouldn't publish black people, as I said, as zoo animals. So why should we treat the Muslims any different? Why are we less human? Why do we have less feelings? And why are our lives not affected by this type of demagoguery?
But it's not just the cartoons that you're referring to and comparing them to cartoons, comparing black people to apes. It's not just cartoons. It's things like the Museum of Metropolitan Art in New York removing all historical representations quietly of Muhammad from its galleries. There are lots of mainstream images of Muhammad that are not shown, and they're not in any way offensive.
The problem with this is it's being seen, and I believe wrongly, through the prism of freedom of speech. Those attacks yesterday are really to be seen through the prism of the war on terror. The Al-Qaeda Yemen alleged to have carried out the attack. It was the foreign policy that has polarised this world, both on both sides, that is creating extreme reactions, extreme human beings on both sides of this world, and that is just another symptom of what's happening in the war of terror. If we really want to dig into this, don't remove images of the Prophet from a museum. Get to the root of this, and this is the devastation across the world.
The right targets in the war on terror, do you think?
Absolutely not. But then I would argue that these cartoonists should never have been killed. Of course they shouldn't, but they're still racist. It's not either we support the terrorists or we support the racists. No, we can have a middle ground. This is, I don't support these terrorists. I don't killing people for disagreeing with me, but neither am I going to support a racist who goes around demonising millions of people.
Douglas Murray, do you think Douglas Murray, let's bring you in now. Sorry, these cartoonists, do you think they were racists?
Could I please come in and correct? You've given goodness knows how much time to this extremist Ashgar Boghari to have his say. Could I please now have my say about this? It's only 24 hours since a dozen people were gunned down in their offices in Paris. It's really rich that Sky News should be giving this platform at this moment to this man.
We're giving you your platform, sir. Do give us your view.
But who you've also allowed to just smear the people who were murdered so brutally in Paris yesterday. You've just allowed them to smear those people as racist.
Not me.
Charlie Hebdo, let me please finish my point. Charlie Hebdo, you don't know this, like you don't know any of the background of this, Ashgar, but Charlie Hebdo is a secularist, far left-wing, anti-racist magazine. It has made a particular delight in recent years, quite rightly, of lampooning and attacking very virulently the far right-wing leader, Marine Le Pen. You say rubbish because you don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, I do.
Let me make the more important point. Let me make the more important point on this.
An actual debate, or are we going to talk about the actual issues here?
Let me make the important point on this, which is that this is not to do with the war on terror, as Ashgar Boghari wants to talk about. This is about freedom of speech.
Please let him speak.
More importantly, you have been massively diverted in this programme from what has actually happened and why. What is going on at the moment, worldwide, and particularly in Europe, is an attempt to shut down any and all criticism of Islam, one religion alone. I'll hold up for a moment. Don't worry, it's not a cartoon of Muhammad. You don't have to get scared. This is the Christmas edition of Private Eye, an image which on the front cover lampoons, and quite rightly, quite amusing, not very, the Virgin Mary and Jesus, and has various jokes about where the frankincense should have been bought from and so on. That's perfectly commonplace. But you know what? If anyone had gone into Private Eye's offices yesterday and massacred the staff because of it in the name of Christianity or Jesus, I think that not only would all of the papers today have been a lot more robust, they would have shown, at the very least, shown this image to show what the person who did the killing was so irate about. The fact is that there is something going on which we have to identify. It is an attempt in our societies to make Islam, and in particular the founder Islam, immune from any criticism. It cannot be allowed to continue.
I still, by the way, just before I start, should say there's a sort of first principle point one should make, which is want to still register how ludicrous it is that we now talk about the cartoon crisis. Just accept it, people say. 11 years ago, if you'd have said, well, there'll be a big cartoon crisis in Europe in the coming years, people would say, what? It's like a Mickey Mouse atrocity, or a Bugs Bunny outrage. It's very tempting to say we've learned absolutely nothing in the last 10 years. I just came from London, and just before I left, went to see an exhibition in London which is finishing tomorrow. Some of you will know the organisers. It's called the Passion for Freedom Art Festival. It's now in its 7th year. It's a wonderful art exhibition which does all those things that artists and art curators pretend they do, you know. It actually is about freedom of speech. It's actually about free expression. It's actually about all those things that the art world likes to say it's about. This year, the exhibition is on Pall Mall in the centre of London, and one of the artworks by a Middle Eastern artist, a female Middle Eastern artist who works under the pseudonym of Mimsy, was withdrawn from the exhibition at the request of the police. Now, the police were shown by the art gallery which this exhibition happens in, were shown the artwork, as it were, to vet the artwork that would go in. And this particular piece, which had been exhibited before, didn't meet the required standards of the British police. And so it was removed. And I don't at all blame the organisers for this, who fought as much of a fight as anyone could and managed to keep other pieces in the exhibition. But of course then there's a secondary one. If you keep this piece in, you'll need security of a bigger magnitude at all of the things, and that's going to cost you. So bit by bit, the language of health and safety meets the language of insurance companies, and it becomes routine that the British police become our art censors. I just about trust the police to catch burglars and stop robbers and muggings. But I don't trust them at all as art critics. And it's bizarre that that is a situation which we've come to. We have come to a situation, as people have said about the Satanic Verses affair, where we've internalised the fatwa. As societies, we've internalised this. And this is one of the things which I think we've learned most clearly from the last 10 years. We've internalised the, absurd to use the phrase still, Mohammed cartoon crisis. But we have learned some things in the last 10 years, and I'll dwell on them for a moment. We've learned, in as clear a way as could possibly have been learned by anybody, that most of the press in free Western countries are cowards. We've learned that most of our artistic establishment are cowards, and that most of our politicians are cowards. We've learned that industries that spend much of their year in awards ceremonies patting themselves and each other on the back for their bravery stop when an actual act of bravery may be required. We have watched as an entire liberal class of artists and writers and thinkers stop just at the point where bravery is needed. We've learned once again, for the first time in some centuries in Europe, about blasphemy. Again, if 20 years ago you'd have said the early years of the 21st century in Europe will be dominated by a discussion of blasphemy, people would have said, what, you don't mean repeal of blasphemy laws, you mean, no, actually the discussion about blasphemy. Probably the next thing people would have said was, well, when did the Spanish Inquisition get back into Europe? How did that happen? No, this is a different type of blasphemy we're talking about. Nobody would have believed you. They'd have thought all of your critical faculties were off, all your prediction mechanisms had gone awry. But that's what the 21st century, not just in Europe, but in a lot of Western countries, is dominated by. Often it's a subterranean conversation, often it goes above that level. Canada, once again, is debating more blasphemy laws. Mark Stein knows this better than anybody by personal experience, but just recently there is another attempt to impose effectively blasphemy laws in Canada. Of course, it's said that this will only have tried to scoop up the most extreme speech and so on, but no. Already the self-appointed censors in Canada are saying that they're looking forward to prosecuting people who engage in so-called hate speech about Islam. The problem they're going to keep on coming across is the problem of facts. It's going to be deeply disturbing for them, but it'll keep on going. I put it to you, what happens in Canada when the new blasphemy laws are in, even stricter blasphemy laws? What happens when the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa is attacked again by Islamic fundamentalists, as it was last year? What happens? What can the free press say about that? What can they say about the motivations of the attacker? Wouldn't it be better if, in the end, the Canadian judiciary and political system could make sure that no press are able to report an attack on the Canadian Parliament because it's not news? Wouldn't it be easier? They now talk about $10,000 fines on people who transgress the new blasphemy laws. Wouldn't it be easier just to have a direct debit system from the bank accounts of every journalist in case they say something about an attack on the Canadian Parliament that an Islamic terrorist has just carried out? Or should they perhaps not say anything about the motivations? Should they just pretend like President Hollande and other French officials did last December when there were a set of extreme Islamists who in cars drove into French pedestrians shouting Allahu Akbar, and President Hollande and all the other French political leaders pretended these were rather mundane, routine traffic accidents? Will it be easier just to pretend these things away? Well, we've learned some other things in the last 10 years. 5 years ago, almost precisely, we learned from Angela Merkel that multiculturalism had failed. 4 years ago, we learned the same thing from President Sarkozy and from Prime Minister Cameron. It's not clear exactly what they meant by that. In fact, as was alluded to earlier, it becomes curiouser and curiouser. It's very strange looking back. What did they mean by that? If multiculturalism was integration, among other things, which was one of the things that Angela Merkel seemed exercised by, why would multiculturalism have failed when migration was at a relatively low point, but it would be just fine when migration was at a higher point than it's ever been in our history? Why would integration not work when migration is relatively low, but we'll have to keep quiet when it's a lot higher? This isn't clear to me, and I'm sure it's not clear to very many of you. Another example, Chancellor Merkel in her New Year message on the Pegida protests. I don't agree with the Pegida protests particularly. That's not the point. It is a legitimate movement of people saying that they dislike some of the things that are happening in their country. But that is not their primary concern was not what Angela Merkel was concerned about. She and the entire administration of her government turns on the reaction to the problem. So in her New Year's message, she says that the Pegida protesters have coldness in their hearts. Why does she not say the Islamists who the Pegida protesters are concerned about have the most incredible coldness in their hearts? That is our primary problem. We must be careful as Germans not to have too much coldness in our own hearts, but that is the problem. No, we have a political class that believes that you can solve these problems by dealing with the secondary symptoms. It is like going to a body racked with disease and solving a skin inflammation. This is a magnificent problem of our time, the inability to grapple with the primary problem. We've learned other things, though, of course. We learned in January this year that absolutely everybody seemed to be Charlie. We learned that Mahmoud Abbas was Charlie. We learned that every politician who has spent the last 10 years calling cartoonists inflammatory and Islamophobic and right-wing and fundamentalists and Enlightenment fundamentalists and troublemakers and so on was Charlie for about an hour. Because we learned very soon after that almost nobody was Charlie. We learned in the end, sadly, that even Charlie wasn't Charlie when earlier this year, perfectly understandably, surviving members of the staff of Charlie Hebdo said they didn't want to keep drawing Mohammed. We've learned other things. We've learned, I would submit, in the last 10 years how incredibly slowly our societies crawl towards truths which should be self-evident. We have spent the last 10 years still going round the circumlocution of whether or not Islam is a religion of peace. We have had so many variations on this circumlocution now that I keep a small notebook that's pretty much filled with them. My favourite is the movement from this terrorist attack has nothing to do with Islam to it has nothing to do with Islam and Islam is in any case a religion of peace, to Barack Obama's best hit ever, which came last year after an American hostage was decapitated in Syria. And Barack Obama said, it not only doesn't have anything to do with Islam, it has less to do with Islam than any other religion. So, if somebody cuts off someone's head while shouting Allahu Akbar, the Buddhist should get it. long before anybody else. Long before the Quakers should have it coming to them. Anyhow, we've learned that it's incredibly slow, our movement towards the truth. But let me give you one. Sorry, it's early in the day, and this is another very graphic example. Let me give you one example of how bad that slow movement towards the truth is. 30 years ago, in my country, we had legislation put in place to make it illegal to carry out female genital mutilation. To date, there has not been one prosecution for this that's been successful. It took, indeed, until a couple of years ago to have any attempted prosecution for female genital mutilation. There have been, as I say, this has been on the statute books for 30 years, and tens of thousands of British girls have been mutilated in this way. Now, I remember 14 years ago or so when Ayaan Hirsi Ali started speaking about this in Holland and others started speaking about it in Scandinavia and elsewhere. I remember about 10 years ago I published a report on FGM in the UK. Throughout most of this time, this was still a culturally sensitive, as they say, subject to talk about. And it was a difficult one. You could feel it as you mentioned it in public. In the last few years, it's become a bit easier. The Evening Standard in Britain ran a campaign against FGM. The Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, joined the campaign. All sorts of politicians from across the political spectrum came out in support of the campaign against FGM. Let me put it to you like this. If you were to select a subject which should be the easiest subject in the world to get total political and popular support for, does anything get easier than saying, we are against the mutilation of young girls' genitals with knives? I can't think of anything. That should be as easy as it gets. It should be a home run. And it's taken 30 years to even get it to being a legitimate political conversation, and one which has still had no practical repercussions. That, I would suggest, is a sign that if we are learning, we're really slow learners. Because the reason why free speech in the British tradition came about, through Milton, Mill and others, was that you had to hear dissident voices, you had to hear contrary opinions, because only if you could hear those opinions and allowed yourself to hear them and to read them and to see them and to view them, could you first of all work out if you yourself were in error. If you were in error, it would strengthen the truth which you held by hearing a contrary opinion. But also, it was possible, and it remains possible today, that contrary opinion, that minority opinion against the overwhelming consensus of your time, might turn out to be right. And if it does turn out to be right, you should not disable yourself from being able to hear it, from being able to read it, from being able to see it. That's why freedom of speech matters. It's because it's the only way we have to avoid error. And that is why what has happened in the last 10 years, and the intimidation and the attempt to shut debate down by people who come in through the front door with Kalashnikovs, and cowardly, cringing officials and others who come through the back door with legislation and so on, are so much part of this problem. Because we need to hear this contrary opinion, because it may just be the case, and I submit to you that it is, that what has been seen to be the contrary opinion in recent years was the opinion that was right, which is that there is a problem, and something about which we should be concerned, and which is going on in our society, and that we would like to stop it. Why, yes, university free speech is a great one, but I could go on. The number of times that anyone engaged in free speech has been cancelled from campus now, I mean, it sort of happens every week. We get used to it, you know. We have radicals who go around, university campuses, recruiting jihadists and so on, and that's fine. If, for instance, you're Omar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib from UCL, University College London, and you run big days where you bring terrorists into campus and you show everyone footage of the planes flying into the Twin Towers, that's free speech. But somebody saying, I don't like that, hate speech. So, you know, universities are the worst. Of course they're the worst. They always were going to be. I mean, I'd go to a university professor to get their ideas on this long after a gardener or a bin collector or anyone else. The universities are so much part of the problem, because so much of this, the problem is the thought disease. I mean, our thinking has gone bad in Europe, it seems to me. And so the centres of so-called learning are no such thing. Let me give a very, very quick example, if I may. A few years ago at a university in London, some students came to me and said their student newspaper was going to run a cartoon of Muhammad, and I think did. The Student Islamic Society leader said that the names of the editors of this student newspaper had appeared on an Al-Qaeda website. You see. This caused a huge furore among the university and so on. Of course, the thing was withdrawn. But then the Student Islamic Society leader said, you know, to the kids who were later done this, you know, well, you know, if you apologise, I can see if I can mediate a bit, you know. And sort of thing. That is the thing that is happening all the time. All the time. People with Kalashnikovs don't have to be very large in number, because behind them they have a whole group of people who find it very useful that they have people with Kalashnikovs on their side. And you know, you can go a long way if you can say, basically, I'm not going, the old, you know, mob trick. You turn up at somebody's door with a huge bouncer in black glasses and, you know, and you say, well, look, I'm not going to hurt you, but my mate, he's mad as hell at you. It's incredibly effective.
Douglas, is the use of the word migrant, is concern over migration, is it racism in another form?
No, of course it's not, and we should long ago have got over the idea that it is, because it's simply been that word you've just used, racist, is used to shut down debate, to terrify people away from a discussion which we should have had a very long time ago and which we've really, I think, avoided and ducked. As for whether or not the term migrant is a pejorative term, as it were, at the moment, I can't see how it is. Most people in Britain regard the opportunity to migrate around as being, good. The point is, however, in certain circumstances, and one of the problems we keep confronting in this is the elision, particularly by those who are in favour of mass immigration, the elision, for instance, between legal and illegal immigration, legal and illegal migration. There is all the difference in the world between people going to a country, going through the correct processes, and then living in that country, and those breaking into the country and breaking the law of that country by doing so. There is also one other quick point. All the difference in the world between people going to a country like Britain and asking for entry because they are fleeing some war zone or some human rights abuse, people fleeing from Syria. There is all the difference in the world between people in that situation and economic migrants who often have a very, substantial and important case, but it's a different thing. And my point is, all of these things are to a great extent being bundled together by people who don't mind the fact that they're bundling it together because they're cases for mass immigration as a whole.
Something like the atrocity in Paris 2 weeks ago occurs, and there are people who are straight out of the starting blocks lying about what has just happened and lying about why it happened. So,
okay,
for
name
instance,
those liars. Yeah.
Right, let's get going. Two gunmen run into a magazine office in Paris, gun down the editors, cartoonists, staff, and come out onto the street screaming, Allah is greatest, and we have avenged our prophet, Muhammad. Which I would have thought was pretty clear what they were saying there and what they were doing and why they were doing it. But immediately you get these weirdos from, let me see, one of the first out of the starting blocks in Great Britain was someone called Asghar Bukhari of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, most famous in Britain for being caught funding the Holocaust denier David Irving in 2006. Asghar Bukhari, a weirdo, sort of foreign policy obsessed hysteric, straight out of the blocks. This has nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with Muslims. It's almost certainly to do with foreign policy. Oh, and by the way, the staff of Charlie Hebdo were racists anyway, just throwing that in. You then get the very, very bizarre response of people saying, across the media in the West, I wonder why they did it. And then people say things about, is it to do with France's failure at better integration policies? Is it to do with the banlieue, the suburbs of Paris? Perhaps it's to do with the people not liking the suburb they are from. Then you have, of course, the grander class of pundit that our politicians have so widely become in the West at the moment. You get David Cameron and President Hollande and all of the heads of European and North American democracies saying it's the most important thing is this has nothing to do with Islam, and we know that because Islam is a religion of peace, and so on and so forth. I could go on for hours about this. Basically, it is an attempt to lie to the general public about what we can all see in front of us, and I find it insulting. I find it insulting because it is not possible in this day and age for a politician or any politicians to stop us, the public, from knowing and reading about things and seeing things before our eyes and recognizing them for what they are. And what this was a very straightforward thing. It was an attempt to impose Islamic blasphemy law in a Western European capital in the 21st century. And I think it is intolerable, has to be resisted, has to be pushed back against. And the beginning of pushing back against it is recognizing what has just happened.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm sorry to make this panel rather Brit-centric after my colleague Majid. This isn't an attempt by us to have a British takeover of the old colony or anything like that. But I was coming earlier from my own fallen empire, referring back to my friend and colleague Ayan's comments earlier, and I was reading the paper, as I'm sure all of you were doing earlier today. Majid finished his comments by talking about the importance of changing paradigms. I'm not sure this is about paradigms. I think it's about facts. Here are some facts in my newspaper earlier. The Times Square bomber, of course, a man just up the road from here who tried to kill thousands of people. Only, by the way, didn't manage it because he set the 24-hour timing device to 7 a.m. instead of 7 p.m. 1900 hours was what it was meant to be. If he had have got that bit right, thousands of New Yorkers would have died earlier this year again. I see further in the paper 12 suspects arrested in France in a network trying to recruit people to go and fight American and other troops in Afghanistan. I turn to another page of the newspaper, and the city I've just flown off from this morning, a Muslim London Underground worker who was had written to his wife, who's off to try to become a martyr for Allah, as he says. He says, more than anything, I wish Allah to grant me martyrdom. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at facts. We should also just quickly, if I may, refer something to the wording of tonight's debate. Ayan's already mentioned this, but I mean, let me put it this way. You're I'm sure, a liberal-minded New York audience, or at least I hope you are. We'll see. But I imagine that if the motion we had here tonight was Christianity is a religion of peace, we get to the Q&A, perhaps even before, and somebody would say, if the other side were arguing for that, somebody would say, what about the Crusades? What about that? And then there'd be some other clever clogs who'd say,
What about that Florida pastor the other week? That was a nasty business. That's Christianity for you. If we'd had tonight, Judaism is a religion of peace, the other side were trying to argue that. Sure as anything, there'd be people popping up in the hall tonight saying, oh, there's this bit in one of the Old Testament books, really, really bad. All sorts of massacres going on. Why don't you talk about that? There might even be people trying to say that, that the argument that Judaism was a religion of peace couldn't be argued because people would say, look at what Israel is doing, and isn't that a direct response, and so on. So let's not have a debate about Islam and whether or not Islam is a religion of peace without talking about the facts to do with Islam. It's an absurd situation we're in, where nothing that anyone does whilst being Muslim is any responsibility of Islam's. Yet anything anyone does whilst being a Christian or a Jew is responsibility of all Christians, all Jews. Let's make this as straightforward as I can. Take the categorization that eminent scholars like Bernard Lewis, Ibn Waraq have made. Let's say Islam is a very, very complex thing. And the best way I can do this in the very short time I have is say you have three Islams. Islam 1, 2, and 3. Islam 1, the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Hadith. Islam 2, the tradition of the Sharia. Islam 3, what Muslims do now. The first of those things, Islam, the Quran, and so on, is bad. It is bad. There is a lot of violence in it. And what's worse, the peaceful verses are superseded by the violent verses. The violent verses also, sadly, are more numerous in number. Then you've got the life of Muhammad. Again, a bad man. A very bad man, it has to be said. Not a great role model, if you look at it. Takes child brides, abuses a small girl, multiple wives, himself a warrior, himself a war criminal, himself beheads Jews. This, I would have thought, would be a signal of not great peacefulness. Then you've got the tradition of the Sharia. Again, not great peacefulness. Still, no schools of Sharia that people in this hall would want to submit to. And thirdly, what Muslims do now, thankfully, there is some hope in that one. Because most Muslims, thank goodness, I almost said thank God, but old habits die hard. Most Muslims don't do what those texts say, because they exercise their judgment as moral beings without having to refer to defunct holy books. It is not a small thing. It's not as it were a detail. It's not like a wacky Florida pastor that you've got the largest Sunni state of Saudi Arabia, the most important Sunni state in the world, the most extraordinary closed prison of a society. It's not a detail. It's not a one-off nut job that the Shiite Republic of Iran is what it is, led by the people it's led by. That is not an accident. It's not a detail. The thing that worries me is that although tonight we hear from the fellow panelists here about how Islam is a religion of peace, the fact is that the people who are making the decisions in the religion, the people who are preaching the religion, the heads of that religion, people like Sheikh Qaradawi, who broadcasts anti-Semitic, the most appalling filth every week on the main networks, that is the faith that's speaking for you guys. I wish that, Ziba, you were on every week on Al Jazeera, but you're not. Qaradawi is. The problem is that Islam is an unstable component. As a religion, an unstable component. 1,000 years ago, the Mu'tazilites tried to reform the religion. They were wiped out. The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not paradigms, but facts. To say that Islam is a religion of peace is to say something based entirely on hope. It's to elevate a hope into truth. And I hope, as you all know, history teaches us that's a very bad thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snow.
There's a tendency when discussing Islam to suspend the tools that we have learnt and studied, that you have studied as well, that we use to analyze every other piece of scripture and literature in the world. And that is that we recognize that texts do not speak for themselves. We recognize that when we interpret scriptures and texts and books and poetry, that they are contextualized, that we have methodologies to approach them. When we're reading Shakespeare, when we're reading anything, we recognize that there's a way to interpret text, and there are schools of thought and differences over how to approach texts. Now, if we contextualize Martin Luther and say the Reformation was a good thing, despite the fact that he said, kill and slay the peasants, wherever you find them, when they followed Thomas Müntzer, when he was calling for not just breaking away from the papal authority, but also for rebelling against the monarchies and the dictators that they found themselves in. Martin Luther sided with the tyrants against Müntzer and said, kill the peasants wherever you find them. Despite that, I'm prepared to say the Reformation was a good thing. And the reason I'm prepared to say that is that Martin Luther must not be judged by the standards of civilization that we, after an accumulation of thousands of years, have arrived at. He must be judged by the standards of civilization that were around during his time.
You don't have followers of Shakespeare who insist on, or are meant to be insist on line by line following everything Shakespeare did and believing everything he wrote. That's because it's literature. Actually, what's happening, Majid, is you've put your finger on the problem. Absolutely. It's not us that isn't applying the rigorous critical faculties. We're applying them to the Quran as we would to any other work of literature. You're not, because you can't. And the final thing on that,
what do you mean
Majid,
what do you mean that he can't?
Well, because Majid knows very well that
Majid is a believer. And believers are not allowed to contextualize the text.
Can I bring you back to my question? What about Martin Luther?
Is that really true?
If you were allowed to contextualize, you would say some of the things that Muhammad did is crap. You would say some of the things he did
is it true that you cannot?
So you contextualize.
Is that true?
No, it's not true. Now, can I say?
What do you think of Muhammad taking a 6-year-old as a bride? What do you think of that?
I don't think that's a particularly good idea. However, what I would say is that there are many.
If there were currently Lutherans, there are Lutherans around. You meet them occasionally in Scandinavia and so on. Very nice, very nice it is, and peaceable guys they are by and large. If, however, there was a large proportion of Lutherans somewhere in Scandinavia that started blowing up non-Lutherans, or no, sorry, let's be absolutely right, started massacring peasants. Do you think that people would say, hang on a minute, let's not criticize Martin Luther, he did that by the standards of his time, we shouldn't criticize his followers all that much, we shouldn't point out what he said and so on. No, we just say, you know, don't go and massacre peasants, full stop. It was rubbish at
Douglas,
the time, it's rubbish now, it's the same with the Quran.
You're missing the point. If you're failing to judge... You just quoted Bin Laden as a scholar and Hassan al-Banna as a scholar. Bin Laden, for those of you who don't know, is an engineer, a qualified engineer. So don't know him.
Why don't you define who is a scholar?
Don't know his history. He's a qualified engineer who comes from one of the richest construction families in Saudi Arabia and was educated in the elite private schools of Switzerland and Saudi Arabia. Hassan al-Banna that you referred to was a school teacher. And in fact, what you find common with all of the movements that you're worried about and that I'm worried about and we're all worried about are that they are founded by people who do not have a theological background. Now, for all we think of Al-Azhar and their very conservative views, what we don't find is that Al-Azhar produces the likes of Bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna, or even Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Maududi was a journalist. Sayyid Qutb, the founder of modern-day jihadism, was a literary critic who came to America on a scholarship in the 1950s to study literature. He was not a theologian. So coming back to the point,
why don't
please,
you name
Ayan,
a number
don't
of scholars
define
who are
for
influential
the
who
whole
are not?
world who a Muslim scholar is. Because actually the people you refer to were not qualified theologians.
But don't...
Majid's trying to imply that the whole extremist problem is a sort of misreading by engineers and literary critics. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case, hasn't been historically in Islam, and isn't now. Ayatollah Khomeini, who Ayan mentioned earlier, was not a self-trained engineer, rich boy like Bin Laden, unfortunately, and managed to hurtle a very developed, distinguished culture back in time in 1979 and hurtled this country back into the state it's currently in under these cloaked dictators. Okay. The Grand Mufti of Egypt is not a self-taught, and yet he taught people the other day that all Muslims should go and fight the Israelis with Hezbollah. But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings, which is as follows, is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, you know, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbour and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of, well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
that many of you in the audience are men, and if the law of average was to fall true, then you'd be probably around 50%. Now, how many of you would be comfortable with your spouse, your wife, as your boss at the same time? And it may sound, it may actually be a truism, because for many people in a marriage, the boss is the wife. But the reason I'm asking that question is that even in times like today, many men find that uncomfortable, to be married to their boss. And yet, Ayan, who referred to these practices that were repugnant to us and said that they are sourced in Islam, the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, his boss, his first wife, was his boss. And many people don't know that. And so what I want to demonstrate by this point is that it's a complex matter. There are practices in Muslim-majority societies that we need to reform, but it's too simplistic to trace them back to the life of a man who lived 1400 years ago, and in many of his practices was quite revolutionary for his time, and in others was like every other man during his time. So the fact that Douglas referred to the fact that he had a bride that was underage is something which we can now look back on and say that was an awful practice. But just as we look back on many things that Romans did and say that was an awful practice, just as we look back on many things that Martin Luther did and said that was an awful practice. But we don't judge these men by the standards that we have today.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray.
No, we do, and we should. We should, Majid. And may I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this, that this is actually a very real concern which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain. In my own country, we now have, thanks to to an arbitration act put into law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. Now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following: 6 women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically abused by their husbands. They were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia, because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so it's all very well to say
just
that it's something
said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
But the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Majid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
So, Douglas,
where is the clear-cut, broad condemnation of terrorism from Muslim leaders?
Yeah, so there have been many such fatwas or pronouncements against suicide bombings. In many cases, they're not reported. There does need to be more. However, I'll give you an example of why in some cases there aren't more. Now, recently we at Quilliam publicized a fatwa by Dr. Tahir al-Qadri against terrorism, a no ifs, no buts condemnation of suicide bombing and terrorism that Douglas, always a pleasure to speak with you on the panel, supported. And was quoted in the press as supporting Dr. Tahir al-Qadri's fatwa against terrorism. Now, the reason why there aren't many more such examples, though there are quite a few, is because prior to Dr. Tahir al-Qadri issuing this fatwa, his colleague, who was also from the same way of thinking, was assassinated in Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber in a mosque where all the other congregants who were praying were also blown to smithereens because he had the guts to simply give a sermon in that mosque condemning suicide bombings. And so this is why many people are scared, because it takes guts, I tell you, to go into Pakistan and try and challenge these extremists. That's a country that doesn't have much rule of law. It's a country that's struggling against the so-called Pakistani Taliban, from taking over a third of their country, and they're fighting that fight on the front lines. And there are those who are brave enough just to give a speech to condemn terrorism, and they're blown to smithereens in their mosque while praying. And surely they're religious people. They were praying in a mosque, Douglas. You did support that fatwa, though, didn't you?
I did. It's the only time I've ever done a book review of a fatwa. I'm sorry to say this, Sir Majid, you seem to have just proved our point.
Yes.
Please explain.
Is it? I mean, I'm very grateful. It's a very important and very interesting question, why more people don't stand up. I much admire Al-Qadri for that fatwa, as I have other people who have stood up. But the number of times I've spoken to clerics behind closed doors and so on, and you say, why aren't you saying anything? They say, because if I do speak up, I'll be killed. Well, I address you again, ladies and gentlemen, to the motion.
No, but hold on. Sorry. Right, hang on. How on earth does fear of being killed in Pakistan by a minority faction of extremists prove Islam is not a religion of peace?
Let me put it this way. Let me put it this way, then.
No, sorry, I've got to... Because really, what you've just said is really quite absurd, and I've got to clarify. It takes one person to kill all of us here. One person in a suicide bombing. Now, if we were scared of saying what we're saying now because of that one person, it doesn't mean all of us love war and hate peace in any way whatsoever. It means we all fear that one person who could walk through that door with a suicide bomb jacket strapped to his chest.
If we were discussing Quakerism here tonight, does anyone think that when a Quaker said, I'm quite fearful about speaking up against certain things in my faith? Come on, this only happens with Islam. There is no other major faith in the world today where it is the case that people are fearful of addressing religion because they're afraid they'll be killed. It's only Islam, and we're saying there's a reason.
The passages that were referred to about fight them wherever you see them. Now, the thing is really, the founding fathers of this great country who wrote the Constitution believed in slavery and were practicing slavery. Now, does that mean that we're going to define the whole of America and its constitution by that practice? Or are we going to contextualize that practice and say that when they founded this country, slavery and abolishing slavery was not at the forefront of their minds, but later on it was abolished, and that's an achievement for this country. It's not something that defines this country. And so, likewise, these passages, yes, they can be used and they are used in a problematic way. And it's our responsibility, not just as Muslims, but as decent human beings, to go out there and challenge the abuse of these passages. But we must not forget that as with every other document in history, it had its context and it was abused. And now when we have gone ex post facto, we can look back to that and judge it with the very civilized standards that we've arrived at and say, that was wrong.
Majid's just given the comparison with the Founding Fathers, and there has to be some clarity about this. This country rightly reveres your Founding Fathers, but you don't think that their word was immutable or unchangeable. Yeah. You don't believe, I don't think that anyone in this room who criticised Mr. Jefferson now here tonight will be declared an anti-American apostate who can be fit for slaughter. The problem that our opponents have to address, this, is that in a religion which is based on the idea that the Quran was dictated direct by God to Muhammad, and that therefore if you are criticizing the Quran or throwing out bits or pulling it apart, like most Christians and Jews have come to that stage, where pretty much you pick a mix with your holy scriptures, and it's quite a good, humane way around it. But with Islam, if this is the revealed word of God, revealed, it has to be said, as it was shown again earlier tonight, in a particularly obscure and unreadable dialect, which, if it was meant to be understood by the whole of the world, it's a bad place to start. If this were the case, then, as I say, we come back to this problem. The Founding Fathers said many great things and did some bad things, but you are not committed as Americans not to criticize the bad things they did, and this is a problem our opponents are going to have to address. I think we, on this side, made it very clear that we don't think there's a fight between Islam and the West, or Islam and civilization, or anything else like that. We've made a very clear set of points tonight. And one of those points, which I hope people will bear in mind, is we have said repeatedly that it is in Muslims and their critical faculties, Muslims and their behavior, Muslims and their faith, that we have hope. And it is in people like you that we have hope for the future. And if the motion were that Islam a century from now could be a religion of peace, and people would be quoting Ziba and Majid and seminal moments like this, and that they had learned, well, that would be terrific. But at the moment, tonight, you're being asked to vote on whether Islam is now a religion of peace. Is Islam a religion of peace? I think it is very clear that it is not. This does not mean, of course it doesn't mean, that Muslims are all violent. We would never make that point. We never have made that point. Nor does it mean that there isn't hope in the future. Nor does it mean that we have to have continual clashes till the end of time. But it means we have to start by being honest. We have to be frank about what we see in Islamic history, in Islamic conquests, and in Islamic scripts. We have to be frank about that.